A plane crash had just shaken the entire nation to its core. Rescue teams believed the mission was complete. The headlines had declared no survivors, and operations were wrapping up. Until Ranger, an aging German shepherd with years of canine service behind him, suddenly broke formation. Without warning, without orders, Ranger veered off from the crash site and sprinted into the woods like he was chasing something only he could sense. What could possibly make a fully trained canine dog abandon protocol like that? What he uncovered next would move even the toughest hearts to tears. It was early morning at JFK International Airport. The first shafts of sunlight were beginning to break through a thick ceiling of clouds, casting a golden hue across runway 5 as the engines of Pacific Horizon. Flight 308 began to hum with steady, rising power. The aircraft, a commercial Boeing 737, was preparing for takeoff from the bustling city of New York, bound for Seattle, a land where endless skies met the rolling green of untouched forests. Inside the cockpit, the glow of the instrument panel lit up the weathered face of Captain James Carter, a man in his early 50s with neatly cropped salt and pepper hair and the kind of calm gaze that reminded people of a still lake at dawn. His uniform, a crisp white shirt with epaulets striped in gold and silver, gave him authority. But it was the steadiness in his movements, the quiet certainty in how his hands touched the controls, that truly inspired trust. He never needed to raise his voice. He only had to look, and those around him would understand. "Fuel load verified. Weather's clean all the way to Montana," came the voice from ground control. James gave a small nod, fingers gently closing around the yoke as if greeting an old friend, the soul of the steel bird he was about to carry into the sky. Next to him sat First Officer Derek Shaw, 2 decades younger, still carrying the eager energy of a soldier new to command. His hands moved methodically through the final checklist. Tire pressure, flight plan, radar status. "All systems normal, Captain. Ready for takeoff." James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out through the cockpit window, watching as the soft morning clouds waited, poised to be torn open by the silver wings of this aircraft. Then, with the smallest of smiles, he replied, "Let's bring them home safe." Beyond the sealed cockpit door, the lives of over 150 passengers unfolded in quiet synchrony. Seatbelts clicked into place. Roller bags bumped along the aisle. Children asked their mothers how long until they'd land. All of it formed a familiar rhythm, a soft, everyday orchestra of travel and anticipation. In seat 17A, Emily Blake rested a hand on her gently rounded belly, where a tiny life pulsed beneath her skin. 7 months along, she had embarked on this solo journey from New York to Seattle, more exhausted than she expected, but resolute. Her pale blue maternity dress made her stand out among the ocean of business suits and laptop bags. Though her face showed the marks of a restless night, her eyes held the quiet strength of someone carrying something sacred. Beside her sat an elderly man named Harold, nose buried in a thick book about World War II aircraft. Now and then, he glanced over with mild curiosity. "Heading home or heading out?" he asked, his voice low but warm. Emily smiled softly. "Home, but to start a new life." A few rows behind, a freckle-faced boy of about 8 played endlessly with a small plastic airplane. His mother, hair in a tight bun, blouse crisp and white, tried to focus on her novel but frequently leaned down to whisper reminders. "Tyler, please stop moving that around." The boy whispered back to the toy in his hand. "Fly high. Don't fall like the last one." In the cargo hold below, luggage sat still, unaware that this journey would not follow the map. That even the most experienced souls on board could never predict what was to come. A voice came through the overhead speakers, clear and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 308 to Seattle. We're expecting smooth conditions all the way. Estimated flight time is 5 hours and 15 minutes. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Outside, the airplane slowly began to roll away from the gate. The rising sun angled through the cockpit windows, scattering light in soft beams across the curved glass, shards of gold cutting through lingering mist. A crew of ground workers gave one last wave, then disappeared into the low dust kicked up by the moving aircraft. "Flaps set, engines stable, ready for takeoff," Derek said, tension slightly pinched in his voice. James tightened his grip on the yoke. "Take us up." The engines roared, thundering forward with the kind of power that echoed human longing, to rise, to reach, to escape. The plane surged ahead, shuddering only slightly before the ground fell away, and it soared, breaking free of the familiar world and entering a sky where everything was unknown. As the aircraft lifted, Emily instinctively placed her hand on her belly again. The baby kicked, almost as if sensing this was the moment their story truly began. In the cockpit, James fixed his gaze far ahead towards the horizon, where the outline of the Rocky Mountains blurred into the morning clouds. None of them, neither the captain, nor the officer, nor the passengers tucked safely behind, could have imagined that this stretch of land would be the place forever etched into the legacy of Flight 308. The Boeing 737 pierced through the first layer of cloud, leaving behind a streak of white, like a fleeting brushstroke on a clean blue canvas. And somewhere deep within the instrument panel, a tiny light flickered. Barely noticeable, just a soft blink, as if trying to whisper a warning that no one yet was ready to hear. Outside, the sky stretched vast and blue like a serene ocean, undisturbed and infinite in its stillness. But within mere minutes, that tranquility began to fracture, the first ripple of tension slicing through the calm like a blade drawn in silence. A sharp ping alarm sounded, subtle in volume but piercing in its clarity, cutting through the hush of the cockpit like a crack forming across glass. Instinctively, James's eyes flicked to the instrument panel. The warning light for Engine 2 blinked in an unforgiving red, not a vague anomaly anymore, but a clear and urgent alert. Oil pressure loss. "Engine 2's pressure is dropping fast," Derek announced, tension threading through his voice as his fingers swept across the line of control switches, voice quivering just beneath the surface, but still braced by training and discipline. James, steady and cold, lowered his voice with purpose, as though suppressing panic by sheer will. "Shut the fuel valve. Engage fire suppression. Let's isolate the engine." Without a moment's hesitation, Derek obeyed, sweat now glinting on his forehead. Outside, the plane's right wing gave a subtle shudder, and the passengers seated nearby began to notice that the vibration wasn't part of the usual rhythm. In the cabin, conversations faltered and then faded, replaced by a thickening silence charged with apprehension. Emily, one hand resting protectively on her belly, felt each tremor coursing up from the floor into the back of her seat, every jolt magnified by the life inside her. Her gaze shifted toward the flight attendant across the aisle, who, without a word, began fastening an additional seatbelt, an action not part of the routine. From the front row, Harold, a tall, silver-haired man seated beside Emily, lifted his head and scanned the cabin, lips pressed tightly together. Behind them, young Tyler set down his toy airplane and looked up at his mother, eyes wide with unease. "Is the plane shaking, Mom?" he asked. She gripped his hand more tightly, offering no answer. At 30,000 feet, the Boeing 737 began to tremble more noticeably. A sound, indistinct, neither quite wind nor metal, rushed along the fuselage, and the right wing dipped ever so slightly, as though straining under an unbalanced force. James activated the emergency comms, his voice clear, resolute. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Pacific Horizon Flight 308. We have engine number 2 failure, requesting immediate vectors to nearest alternate airport." The reply came through static, the controller's voice warped by interference. 308, roger that. Rerouting to Billings Airport. Maintain current heading for now. Inside the cockpit, James stared ahead. The aircraft still held altitude, but the right side controls were sluggish, responding with the resistance of a body struggling to move after losing a limb. He glanced at Derek and said quietly, "We need to stay calm. Passengers feel us before they hear us." The lead flight attendant stepped into the cockpit, her face drawn with tension. James spoke quickly, without pause. "Tell your team to stay composed. Keep passengers seated. We're rerouting. No need for panic." She nodded, turned, and exited, sealing the door behind her. But in the cabin, fear had already begun to seep in like an invisible vapor. Whispers rising between seats, fingers fumbling for phones to send hurried texts, voice memos, or calls that wouldn't connect. Emily felt her abdomen tighten, not just from the turbulence, but because the baby was reacting too. A violent jolt knocked over her cup, cold water soaking through her dress. She didn't care. Her eyes were fixed on the seatbelt sign, glowing crimson like a wound. In the overhead bin, a poorly secured suitcase sprang open, its contents tumbling loose. Outside the right wing, a thin stream of smoke began to unfurl, like a thread unraveling into the vastness of the sky. Hard to see, but unmistakable to anyone looking closely. Something was wrong. Derek's voice came through the intercom. "Engine 2 completely offline. Controls lagging on the right." James gave a tight nod, hands gripping the yoke. "We'll fly this bird with one wing if we have to." Below them, the jagged spine of the Rockies emerged in stark clarity. No longer a distant silhouette, but a series of snow-laced peaks rising like blades, sharp and cold and endless. There was no flat ground for landing, no margin for another mistake. Suddenly, a muffled boom, low but forceful, reverberated through the entire aircraft. Passengers screamed. Oxygen masks dropped sporadically, some unprompted, others half-deployed. The fear was no longer intangible. It had taken form, flickering through the eyes of every soul on board like a shadow. In the cockpit, Derek turned toward James. "Sir, should we begin emergency descent?" James remained silent, listening, not to instruments, not to alarms, but to something deeper, something beyond training. Then he looked at Derek, voice unwavering. "Not yet. We're not done trying." Outside the cockpit window, the slanted rays of the evening sun pierced the clouds, casting amber light across the aircraft's fuselage, like one last beam reaching out to hold a giant body struggling to balance in the void. And then, just as the systems fought to keep the aircraft aloft, just as whispered prayers passed like confessions between passengers, a new sound emerged from the underbelly. Not an engine, not an alarm, but the distinct mechanical click of a small hatch unlatching beneath the fuselage. James snapped back to the display. The aerodynamics chart plummeted. The left wing was pulling off balance. The tail section began to shudder unpredictably. The aircraft was losing equilibrium. The radio burst into static once more, then cut to silence. "Lost contact. We're flying blind," Derek reported, his voice lower now, as if he too needed to hear himself speak just to stay grounded. James looked at the altimeter. The numbers were dropping rapidly. Cabin pressure began to plunge. There was no time left to run calculations, no simulator scenarios to recall. Every protocol he had ever known was already slipping out of reach. This was no longer a drill. This was real. "Prepare for emergency descent," James commanded, his voice cutting through the thickening fog of panic like the sound of a cathedral bell. Resonant, not loud, yet every syllable seemed to slice clean through the rising tide of fear that had begun to flood the cabin. The alarm blared across the passenger compartment. Red lights blinked in a relentless rhythm. Oxygen masks dropped down from the overhead panels, one by one, dangling in the air like silent hands reaching out in the dark, stretching into a chaos they couldn't calm. And in that moment, the shouting began, high-pitched, unfiltered, unstoppable, waves of screaming crashing over rows of seats, breaking the thin dam that once held a fragile sense of control. Emily clutched her belly, hands trembling as she yanked down the mask, her eyes wide as they turned toward the window, where the blue sky had turned the color of molten lead. She could feel every vibration, every drop in altitude, each one rattling not just the aircraft, but the fragile rhythm of her own heart. Beside her, Harold placed a firm hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He simply kept his palm there, steady and warm, as if willing a sliver of strength from a long life lived into the body of a woman carrying new life. "Brace position! Heads down! Hold your knees!" a flight attendant shouted, her voice cracking under the roar of the wind now clawing at the fuselage. In the cockpit, James tightened his grip on the control column, every muscle working to hold the aircraft steady. Auxiliary systems were failing one by one. The altimeter showed just over 12,000 feet, the rate of descent accelerating like a hammer dropped from a great height, with gravity taking no mercy. "Derek, get the crew ready. Emergency evacuation protocol, now." Derek turned, his face ashen, but discipline kept his hands moving, following the procedure step by step. Below the floor of the main cabin, in the emergency access hatch, were 3 survival parachutes, standard issue for the flight crew, to be used only if the aircraft could not be landed. The hatch creaked open. A blast of freezing air slammed into the cockpit like an open-handed slap, and Derek had to brace against the wall to keep from being pulled into the void. He stared into the compartment. The parachutes were tightly packed, harnesses wound around steel pins, ready to be yanked free. 3. No more. In the main cabin, the light flickered like the fading heartbeat of a tired heart. Some passengers began to pray, others sobbed, clinging to pictures or whispering names of loved ones. Some sat in silence, frozen, their eyes already glazed over as though they had left their bodies behind. Emily leaned forward, her head bowed, hand still resting on her belly. There was nothing more she could do. Nothing left but hope. Back in the cockpit, James was no longer looking at his instruments. His eyes followed Derek as he returned, breath shallow, voice barely audible as he said, 3 chutes. James nodded. "Take 1. Pick 2 crew members. Go fast." "Sir, what about you?" The question fell into a silence that said more than any reply. James didn't speak. He just looked at Derek with the kind of gaze senior officers give to the ones they've trained. The kind of gaze that carries a final command without needing to say the words. "Do what you must. Don't ask why." Derek clenched the side rail, turned, and disappeared into the passenger cabin. One flight attendant was already standing by. The second chute was given to the youngest crew member, and the third, still untouched. No one had yet decided who would claim the final chance. James sealed the cockpit door behind him and took a long, deliberate breath. He knew where the plane was heading, toward the rugged wilderness of Montana, a place with no runways, no beacons, no safe ground, only trees, only rock, only cold. He opened a compartment beside the pilot's seat and retrieved an old field radio, the kind he'd once carried during his military days. Outdated, maybe, but sometimes what's old and worn is the most enduring. At 8,000 feet, he unlocked the panel just behind the cockpit. He didn't leave his seat. He only bent down and pulled out the last parachute, held it in both hands, and then, Through the narrow glass at the rear of the cabin, he saw her. Emily. She sat quietly, no longer crying, her face turned toward the window, not to watch the clouds, but to speak to the small life inside her. One hand on her safety belt, the other gently stroking her belly, slow and soothing, like a lullaby made of touch. James stood and walked toward her. No one noticed. No one saw the captain rise from his seat. He knelt beside her, meeting her eyes straight on. There wasn't time for explanations. No heroic speeches. Only one sentence, just enough to change the path of 2 lives. You have to survive. Not for you, for the one you carry. And before she could respond, before she could protest, he lifted the parachute onto her back, secured the straps, and fastened the buckle. Emily broke into sobs, her mouth opening as if to argue. But James simply placed a hand on her shoulder, gave a small nod, and turned away. A violent tremor rocked the plane. Louder, longer, the wounded cry of a steel bird tumbling toward the earth. The emergency door burst open. The wind screamed into the cabin, shredding through curtains and loose paper like a storm given form. And then, through the noise, through the chaos, a figure was pushed out. A silhouette curled around her unborn child. Falling, swallowed by the clouds, spun into the gray unknown. James stood alone at the doorframe, his coat flapped violently in the wind, his eyes locked onto the shrinking shape below. It wasn't just a passenger he was watching. It was a piece of himself, released into the world. His graying hair clung damp to his forehead. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He only gripped the doorframe tighter, as if holding on to the weight of the promise he had just let go. Wind crept into the cabin, threading itself through every narrow seam, carrying with it the acrid scent of heated smoke and the soft clatter of trembling metal fragments, as if the very bones of the aircraft were beginning to whisper their fatigue. And in that moment of suspended time, the last light of sunset kissed the edge of the wing, igniting a brilliant streak of orange, like a quiet farewell spoken from the heavens. Back in the cockpit, James said nothing. He returned to his seat, lowered himself gently as though settling into an old memory, his hand resting on the control yoke with the same reverence a sailor might feel upon returning to the helm of a ship bound for its final voyage. A vessel he had trusted, loved, and was now prepared to follow to the very end. The altimeter read just under 3,000 feet. The Rockies loomed directly ahead, no longer distant giants, but sharp, jagged spears of stone that rose like colossal bayonets, ready to tear through anything that dared touch them. And in that fragile instant, fragile like glass held in trembling hands, James did not think of himself. He thought of Emily, the young woman with the round, full belly and the eyes wide with terror the moment she saw the hatch swing open, her hands shaking uncontrollably as he fastened the parachute onto her back, fingers fumbling with the straps like someone clinging not just to life, but to the hope of another. He remembered the way her voice caught in her throat, how no words of thanks could emerge, because her body was filled to the brim with fear and feeling. But he had already said everything in a single, quiet sentence. You must live. It wasn't a command. It came not as an order, but like the final breath at the end of a long day, soft, almost weightless. Yet it carried the full gravity of a heart placed gently in another's hands. He didn't know if the parachute would open in time. He didn't know if the land below was forest or rock, salvation or obliteration. But he knew, he believed, that if anyone was to be entrusted with that one fragile chance, it was her, not because she was pregnant, but because she carried a future that he, after a lifetime spent touching the sky, had never truly held. Behind him, in the rear of the cabin, the whispers of prayer still echoed, faint, broken, fractured by sobs and the violence of a world descending. Some seats had torn free of the floor, careening forward like dice scattered across a tilted table, the organized illusion of civilized life crumbling into a chaos governed only by instinct and whatever faith remained. And in the very heart of that chaos, James felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind born from resignation, but from resolve. From the clarity of choosing not to keep the parachute, not to cling to survival as something owed, but to give it away freely. And so, in these final seconds, his heart felt empty in the most delicate, almost beautiful way. Beyond the cockpit windows, the sky had faded into a dusky palette of violet and ash, evening light surrendering to the encroaching dark, and a flock of birds crossed the horizon, black silhouettes scratching across the silver sky like ink on parchment. They did not know that within moments, a Boeing 737 would streak across that same airspace like a wounded arrow, lost to direction, falling, until it would vanish into the embrace of the earth as if it had never existed. The final alarm screamed, a long, unbroken wail echoing like a battle drum signaling the end. Every system had gone dark. The control panel lights flickered once and then extinguished. All that remained was the terrible shriek of a machine being pulled downward into forest and stone. James kept his gaze fixed forward, unblinking, his eyes never leaving the horizon now swallowed by ink. And then, in one quiet, deliberate gesture, he reached out and touched his pilot's cap resting on the dashboard. He didn't put it on. He simply touched it, as one might touch memory itself, as one might brush against an entire life lived in the skies. Then, suddenly, a light, a soft, unexpected glint from the right. Not lightning, not fire, but the reflection of a hidden lake nestled in the forest, its glassy surface mirroring the heavens, casting a glow of velvet against the endless dark of trees. It was not a landing site. It was not salvation. But for James, it was something else entirely. A gentle touch from nature itself, a quiet farewell for the man who had chosen to give everything. And then came the final scream, the longest, sharpest sound Flight 308 would ever make. No one knew the precise second of impact. No one heard anything but a silent flash deep in the forest. But somewhere, far from wreckage and flame, among the pines and the still, unspeaking snow, a heartbeat echoed, slow, steady, fighting to continue. Just 25 minutes after Flight 308 vanished from radar, every national news network broke into special coverage. A map blinked across the screen, the electronic display showing a hazy red zone across the Rocky Mountains, marking the last known location of the aircraft, an unforgiving terrain cloaked in snow year-round, with no roads leading directly in. At the Montana Coordination Center, there was no time for hesitation. Within less than an hour, a joint task force was mobilized. Emergency medical teams, firefighters, the National Guard, and specialized mountain search and rescue units. Among the names called into immediate action was one man fastening the last strap of his insulated winter jacket, eyes locked onto the slowly fading blip on the radar screen. Sergeant Ryan Mitchell. He wasn't the tallest nor the most imposing among his fellow soldiers, but there was something about him that stayed with people long after introductions ended. Not his rank, nor his frame, but a certain stillness. Not the stillness of indifference, but the quiet resolve of someone who had walked through loss and returned from places stripped of human warmth, carrying with him the silence only survivors understand. Beside him, a shadow moved. 4 legs, silent steps. Coarse fur, streaked with dust and time, eyes sharp but loyal in the way words could never quite convey. His name was Ranger, a German shepherd who had searched through over 30 missions, digging through snow, rock, and burnt wreckage in pursuit of the final breath of a soul not yet gone. Ryan knelt down in silence, his fingers working with practiced care as he fastened the tracking device onto the collar of Ranger, a motion so familiar it felt like second nature. Then gently tapped the center of Ranger's forehead, just once, a quiet signal the two had used in hundreds of training sessions before, a language built not on words, but on trust, forged through sweat, snow, and long hours in silence. There was no need to speak. Ranger understood. The first medevac helicopter lifted off at 1903, its rotors carving into the dimming sky like blades slicing through the last breath of twilight in the western sky. Inside the cabin, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades mixed with the static-laced voice of the radio and the measured, steady breathing of those who knew that what lay ahead wasn't just a mission. It was a race against time, against the cold, and against the fragile flicker of hope that refused to die. Through the window, Ryan caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the glass, and just behind him, Ranger lay completely still, eyes wide open, locked on the tremble of the aircraft with an intensity that felt almost human. The last golden rays of sunlight stretched across Ranger's back, turning the fur into a shimmering gold, like a flickering flame headed into a land of frost and silence. "The predicted impact zone is 60 kilometers deep into the mountains. No access road," came the voice in his earpiece. "We'll drop Team and K9 at the central camp, then split off in search vectors." By the time the helicopter touched down, the sun had fully disappeared behind the peaks. The temperature had dropped to below -10 degrees Celsius. There was no time to rest. Ryan and Ranger were the first to move northwest, toward a blotch of darkness spotted on satellite thermal imaging, a patch that could either be the impact site or just a void in the snow. They advanced past jagged cliffs and craggy ridgelines where radio contact with the other teams faded into nothing, swallowed by the fractured terrain. All that remained were the sounds of wind scraping through ancient treetops, boots pressing into brittle snow, and the heavy breath of those walking the knife edge between life, death, and the ever-thinning thread of hope. Midway through a narrow mountain pass, Ranger came to an abrupt stop. Ears perked, nose twitching. Ryan crouched beside him, hand resting on the dog's back. "What is it, buddy?" Ranger didn't bark, just stepped forward 3 paces, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. His eyes gleamed under the headlamp's beam, bright, focused, unwavering. A branch snapped somewhere up ahead. A scent floated faintly on the wind. Not blood, not fire, human, buried beneath layers of wet earth, thawing snow, and rotting leaves. Ryan pulled the strap of his pack tight and retrieved his handheld GPS. "This area isn't marked. Ranger, lead the way." Ranger turned sharply and bolted forward, not recklessly but fast, precise, and deliberate, his path cutting through the snow like a compass needle drawn by something deeper than instinct. Ryan followed without hesitation, his heart hammering not from fear, but from something else. Intuition, that strange sixth sense all seasoned rescuers carry but never quite explain. They ran through a narrow gap in the rocks, descending into a bowl-like hollow blanketed in fresh snow. And there, caught on a brittle branch just ahead, hung a scrap of light blue fabric. Ryan approached slowly, hand trembling slightly though his eyes never left the ground before him. The snow was torn, revealing a long drag mark, and within it drops of deep red blood congealed into beads of ice. At the end of that track, Ranger stood still, not barking, not wagging, his gaze fixed on a fallen tree, angled against the hillside like a wound in the landscape. Ryan dropped to a crouch, headlamp aimed into the hollow where the roots had torn up from the earth, revealing a narrow crevice. Inside, scraps of cloth, strands of hair, and faint smears of blood clung to the shadows like fading memories, half buried by snow and silence. There were no sounds, no movement, just a heavy, suffocating stillness, as if the air itself had frozen into a fog that wrapped around his fingers as they reached for some trace of life still lingering in the dark. He called out, voice low but urgent, "Is anyone there?" No answer. Ranger leaned in, sniffed again, then began to move, not aimlessly, but with renewed purpose. His ears were sharp, his eyes narrow and scanning. Something had shifted. Something ahead was pulling him forward, and Ryan knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Only hours later, when the main rescue teams finally reached the coordinates marked as the primary crash site, the scene unfolded like a war-torn canvas ripped apart and laid bare beneath the trees. The fuselage had shattered into 3 sections, strewn across a valley split in half by a natural fault line. Trees lay flattened in rows, snapped like matchsticks. The nose of the plane had buried itself into the ground, carving out a crater of scorched earth wider than 200 square meters. The tail had been blown clear, resting crooked among slabs of stone. The center, the passenger section, had been flattened into little more than twisted metal and ash. Smoke still drifted into the air in sluggish spirals. Some seat frames still smoldered. And in that cold, desolate place, there were no voices calling out. No cries for help, only the wind and footsteps on wet snow. Ryan stood at the edge of the wreckage, his eyes scanning each shattered piece of the aircraft, each body bag tied around limbs gone cold. Every time Ranger found someone, he didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply sat beside them, quiet and still, like a sentinel paying respects. There was no need for noise. The silence said everything. Preliminary reports, 4 hours in. 114 bodies recovered. No survivors. An officer walked past Ryan, removing his cap in silence. No one spoke. Words like "stay strong" or "keep looking" had lost all meaning here. In a place so destroyed, there was nothing left to hold on to. The rescue team leader whispered into his radio, voice low and tired, weighed down by dusk and the growing quiet. Cease active search. Shift to body recovery. Nightfall's closing in. Ryan didn't respond immediately. His eyes were on Ranger, the shepherd dog standing motionless at the edge of the wreckage zone, its muzzle lifted into the mountain wind as if challenging the invisible current rushing down from the ridge. But its gaze was not fixed on the shattered remains of the aircraft. It was turned westward, toward the forest thickening into heavy shadows, toward the place no team had dared step into since the beginning of the operation. "You smell something?" Ryan asked softly. Ranger didn't turn. It only released a barely audible whine, then took a single deliberate step into the darkening trees. Ryan hesitated. The field of vision around him was narrowing fast as cold mist began rising from the ground like breath exhaled from the mountain itself. His radio crackled in his ear again. "Mitchell, confirm your location. Status update on Sector 17C. He lifted the transmitter, his voice dropping into a thoughtful register. Still surveying the western boundary. Noticing something unusual? Copy that. Recovery in progress. Recommend you return to Central Post before full dark. But Ranger whined again. Quiet, low, but insistent. It moved forward, not with the urgency of a chase, but with the steadiness of purpose, stepping confidently across wet grass and fractured stone, leaving behind the glare of the rescue lights and the comfort of the marked zone. Ryan glanced skyward, Clouds hung heavy and thick, swallowing the last traces of sunlight. But somewhere behind that curtain of gray, a sliver of twilight still glowed in hues of deep indigo and violet, like the faint ember of a hope not yet completely extinguished. He said nothing more. He simply tightened the straps on his pack, switched his headlamp back on, and followed Ranger into the dark line of the forest, beyond where the search boundaries ended, beyond where the flags and markers stopped, beyond where voices could carry, into a silence broken only by the wind and the imprint of his boots on the cold, damp earth. And deep in that forest, nearly 7 kilometers from the main crash site, Ranger halted. This time, it did not sit, nor bark, nor whimper. It simply stood, tail still, head tilted slightly as if listening to something Ryan could not hear. Ryan moved forward slowly, eyes scanning the ground. There, a single wildflower, delicate and purple, growing alone in disturbed soil. There, a fabric bag, dirt-stained and half-buried beneath a carpet of dead leaves. And there, something glinting faintly beneath the trunk of a leaning tree, a flicker of metal catching his headlamp like a breath frozen mid-air. Ryan dropped to one knee, brushing aside the leaves with care, his movements deliberate and reverent, as though each small remnant in this forgotten corner might carry the ghost of someone yet unnamed. His fingers found the soft impression of a footprint embedded in the damp earth. Still whole, untouched by wind or scavengers. The print was small and light, likely a woman. And what made him pause, breath caught in his throat, was the telltale uneven edge at the toe, the subtle skew in the gait, perhaps from someone limping or someone carrying weight to one side, or someone pregnant. He didn't have time to retrieve his GPS to mark the location before Ranger let out a sudden, sharp whine. Not loud, but urgent. Different. Unlike any alert Ryan had heard across dozens of missions, not the signal for danger, not the scent of death, Ranger lifted its head, ears rising like twin sails into the wind, eyes sweeping the space, and then, with a suddenness that felt pulled by an invisible thread, the dog turned and bolted, not toward what they had just found, but back across the path they had taken, veering sharply left into uncharted forest, a place unmapped, unsearched. Ryan froze. "Ranger!" he called, not to stop him, but from the sheer shock of it. But Ranger didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't look back. Its forelegs carved clean through layers of leaf mold and wet soil, forging ahead into the thick undergrowth where no other human had yet stepped. Ryan stood in the narrow clearing, his back damp with sweat gone cold. In his ear, the radio crackled again, louder, more authoritative now. "Mitchell, confirm your position immediately. You are moving off-grid and exiting approved search radius. Return to your coordinates per direct order." His hand gripped the radio tight, eyes still fixed on the last flicker of movement where Ranger had disappeared. And in that moment, training collided with something older, deeper, a tension between 10 years of disciplined protocol and something more primal, intangible, but utterly compelling. Trust. The kind of trust that had never, not once, steered him wrong. Not with this dog. He pressed the button on the microphone. "I'm following Ranger. He has something. I take full responsibility." "Mitchell, listen clearly. If you continue, you'll lose comms within 3 minutes. Lights dropping fast. Do you confirm?" He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lowered the radio, fingers loosening. His eyes never left the direction Ranger had gone. The wind hissed through the high branches above, the dying light of late afternoon casting thin bands of gold and ash across his face, like a line drawn between duty and belief. Ranger, now barely visible some 30 meters ahead, had stopped again and turned. Its eyes, glowing faintly through the mist, burned like twin embers. There was no urgency in its stance, only that same unwavering confidence that Ryan would follow. He inhaled deeply, then stepped forward. One step, then another. Then he ran, dry leaves scattered under each footfall. Each breath shortened. Cold wind lashed against his cheeks. But he didn't stop. He didn't look back. Because ahead of him, Ranger was gaining speed. Suddenly, Ranger stopped, and Ryan stopped with him, not out of breath, not out of exhaustion, but because something in the air, in the quiet tension around them, screamed that what lay ahead was different, deeply and undeniably different. Ranger crept forward 3 slow steps. No barking, no digging, no sudden sprint. Just a low, almost inaudible whine, drawn out in short, deliberate breaths, like a whisper offered to the forest itself. Ryan reached up and flicked off his headlamp, stepping forward with the slow, steady movement of someone approaching something sacred or forgotten. In front of them was a dense wall of fallen trees, their trunks crisscrossing like a makeshift barricade, sculpted not by wind or storm, but by something, or someone, trying to stay hidden. The wind had stopped. The forest held its breath. The light was fading fast. And then, Ranger lifted his head again, ears twitching. He wasn't staring at a specific point, not locking onto a target the way he usually did. No, his gaze drifted past the trees, past the visible world, toward a space behind the thicket where human eyes could see nothing. But his eyes, trained by instinct older than memory, had already reached something beyond logic, beyond maps, beyond explanation. Ryan didn't move, barely breathed, eyes tracking Ranger's every motion. Around them, the world stood still. No insects, no wind, not even the rustle of branches. As if all of nature had paused, waiting for one final footstep to shatter a silence that had lasted 1,000 years. Ranger let out another soft, urgent whine, then turned, suddenly, decisively, and darted forward, slipping between trunks, pushing past vines, vanishing into the rising mist like a shadow called home. Ryan bolted after him without hesitation, boots pressing deep into the damp underbrush, hands sweeping sharp branches from his path. Every step took him further from the marked zones of safety, deeper into the unknown, off the grid, off the maps, and beyond the reach of anyone who could help. His radio sputtered, voice commands breaking into static, then silence. His GPS light blinked once, then died. Still, Ryan kept moving. He didn't need a signal. All he needed now was the beam of his headlamp slicing through the fog ahead, and the flickering silhouette of the brown-coated shepherd leading the way, driven by a force no training could replicate. The light from his lamp threw Ranger's shadow high onto the trees, dancing like ink in motion across living bark. The breeze returned, this time softer, carrying the scent of damp soil, moss, and something else, something faint, fleeting, unmistakably human. It wasn't sweat, it wasn't blood, it was the scent of a body, a presence, a whisper not yet spoken. They passed through a narrow trail. Could have been made by wildlife, or someone desperate enough to crawl through untouched forest. No footprints, no markings, just a hunch. But Ryan had long since learned to trust the hunches that came with Ranger. He didn't ask questions, didn't doubt. Every pause meant something. Every breath, every quiet growl, every swift movement forward was a signal, a certainty. Ranger knew, and that was enough. After nearly 30 minutes navigating the dense underbrush, they reached a sudden dip in the terrain. The earth fell away sharply into a hidden valley, its walls coated in moss and long curtains of vine. The wind here had changed. It no longer howled but whispered, brushing cold against their skin like it rose from deep underground. Ranger stood at the edge of the cliff, unmoving. He tilted his head, then sat, not advancing, eyes locked on the dark hollow below, beyond the reach of Ryan's light. Ryan stepped closer, lowered his headlamp, letting the beam sweep along the floor of the valley. At first it was just rock, tree roots, scattered leaves, until the light struck something soft, something unnatural, a pale blue scrap of fabric, torn and ragged, caught between the tangled arms of two gnarled roots. Ryan's heart tightened. He dropped to one knee at the edge of the slope, eyes fixed on that patch of color. It was no more than 25 meters away. Close enough to see, far enough to be unsure. Every instinct told him to run, but his training told him to wait, to look. Ranger didn't move. His eyes, once focused on the scrap, now shifted, again, to that empty space in the dark. That place with no light, but with an undeniable weight. A presence no one could explain, but no one could ignore. Ryan turned on his radio. Tried transmitting. Silence. No response. No more communication. No more backup. No one knew where he was now. Only Ryan and Ranger, and ahead of them, something the world had already decided was gone. A breeze drifted through the valley floor, rustling the decaying leaves. A branch dropped from somewhere high, hit the ground with a brittle crack, a sound so quiet, yet loud enough to feel like a summons. Ryan tightened the strap of his headlamp, then began to move forward, each step toward the edge deliberate, each breath heavier than the last. A few more steps, and he'd be close enough to know. Ranger stood again, took 2 steps forward, then lifted his head and let out a soft whine. Brief, low, but laced with urgency. Ryan looked at him, then back toward the dark. His light passed across a patch of yellowed grass, and something moved. Just for a fraction of a second. Not an animal, not clearly human, not clear at all, but real. There was life below. Ryan's chest clenched, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of realization. The impossible wasn't impossible anymore. The door they'd all thought locked, sealed by fire and silence, had just opened with the softest push. Ranger cried out again, louder this time, then charged straight down the slope. No order given, no command required. Ryan followed instantly, stumbling over roots, leaping over loose soil, beam of light bouncing wildly along the curve of the valley floor as he chased the only thing that still felt real. When Ranger stopped, the forest went still again. In front of them lay a massive fallen tree, its roots twisted and raised like the broken fingers of a giant's hand, grasping upward towards the sky. Ranger began to dig, one paw, then another, at a thick bed of leaves pressed tight against the base of the trunk. Ryan dropped beside him. "Show me, Ranger," he whispered. Ranger stepped back half a pace, eyes never leaving the ground. With bare hands, Ryan pulled the layers of decay aside. The earth was wet, cold, the scent of rot strong and heavy. He didn't wear gloves. He needed to feel it, every shift, every detail. Beneath the 3rd layer of dirt and debris, a scrap of fabric emerged, blue, frayed, stained with old, dried blood. Ryan froze. No words, no breath. Then, slowly, he swept further, deeper, until his fingers brushed skin. A hand. Pale. Thin. Curled beneath the roots. "Oh, God," Ryan murmured, voice breaking into mist. He pressed 2 fingers to the woman's wrist. The skin was ice, but the pulse, faint, so faint, was there. "Emily Blake," he whispered, as though naming a ghost he'd never met, but had carried with him for weeks in fragments, search reports, victim lists, hopeless updates. And now suddenly, she wasn't a name anymore. She was here. Real. Alive, so delicate, so fragile, that even the wind could have broken her. And yet somehow, she had held on. She was unconscious, her face smeared with dried blood and streaks of mud, her hair matted into wild tangles, looking more like the remnants of a decaying forest than anything human. A long tear ran down the side of her torso, the fabric of her shirt soaked into a dark stain where blood had mingled with dirt, and her abdomen, unmistakably rounded, 7th month, maybe more, rose beneath the cloth in silent testimony to the fight still taking place within her. Ryan brought the beam of his headlamp closer, carefully tracing the light along the contour of her body. Fresh blood was seeping out. Not a lot, but it was flowing. His gaze dropped to her belly, and for the first time, he saw it. A soft, irregular ripple beneath the thin fabric. Faint, uneven, but unmistakable. She was in labor. Ryan inhaled deeply, tightened the strap of his backpack, unzipped the medical kit with deliberate hands. Stay calm, he told himself, not only as instruction, but as prayer, as a lifeline tethering both himself and the woman lying in front of him, unconscious, but not yet lost. Ranger remained motionless beside her, silent and still, eyes locked on Emily's face with a focus so intense it felt almost human, as if the dog, too, was willing breath into her chest, begging silently for life to hold on just a little longer. Ryan checked the basic vitals: pulse, breath, pupils. Her reactions were slow, but present. There was still something to hold on to. He reached for the canteen, moistened a clean cloth, and gently wiped the crusted blood from the corners of her mouth. Then, leaning in close, voice low and steady, he whispered, "Emily, can you hear me? My name is Ryan. I'm here to get you out of this." No answer, but then a sound. Barely a whimper, soft as wind brushing the treetops. But to Ryan, it was the most alive sound he'd heard through the entire search. He immediately triggered the emergency radio. "Command, this is Mitchell. I have located a survivor. Female. Unconscious. Bleeding. Signs of active labor. Requesting immediate evac." Static. Then silence. He repeated it, again. No reply. He clenched the mic, but he didn't curse. He couldn't afford rage, not now. He had one job: sustain life until help could find them. He pulled off his jacket, spread it across the ground, and gently lifted Emily from the damp forest floor. Ranger moved in close, curling up on her other side like a living blanket, shielding her from the cold gusts now threading down from the ridge above. Another contraction struck. Ryan looked at his watch. From the moment he saw fresh blood to now, the clock was running, maybe under 3 hours before labor entered full force. A faint wind slid across the valley. Above them, the sky had lost its final sliver of daylight, giving way to a creeping mist settling like breath across the treetops. But in that darkening hollow, Ranger didn't move. He lay as still as a sentinel, preserving warmth, guarding breath, holding on to this fragile moment like it was glass in his paws. Ryan placed another layer of clothing over Emily, hand to her forehead. Cold, but not lifeless. A pulse still beat faintly beneath the pale skin. He opened the backpack, drew out the emergency field kit. Antiseptic gauze, gloves, clean cloth, a sealed pouch of saline solution. By the muted glow of his headlamp, he began tending to the wound at her side. Blood flow had stopped, but bruising had already begun to bloom around the edges. He couldn't stitch, he couldn't transfuse, but he could clean, he could stabilize, he could preserve warmth. Each movement was careful, reverent, like he was handling something sacred. Not because she was pregnant, but because she was alive, because she was still fighting, even if her eyes wouldn't open and her voice couldn't rise. Once the bleeding was stemmed and the dressing secure, Ryan sat down beside her, radio in hand once more, scrolling through emergency frequencies. He knew they were out of range, but he tried anyway. "This is Sergeant Ryan Mitchell, SARK-9 unit. Currently at unknown location, Western Basin beyond Sector 17C. One female survivor, pregnant, in labor. Critical status, requesting immediate assistance." He released the button. Static answered. He tried again. 3 more times. Still nothing but the white hiss of isolation. He placed the radio beside Ranger, then turned back to Emily. Her body still limp. Her breath shallow, uneven, but it was there. Cold sweat slicked her brow, her hands clenched involuntarily with each mounting wave of contraction. Ryan knew he couldn't let her drift, not into deeper unconsciousness. Awareness was life. And sometimes, the only thing keeping someone from slipping away was a voice, real, close, warm. He leaned in, close to her ear, and whispered, "Emily, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to talk anyway, and you just listen, all right?" There was no response, but he kept speaking, as though each word was a thread thrown across the void, tying her soul back to the world. "You know, I used to think missions like this only happened in movies. Plane crashes, survivors, a baby born in the middle of a forest. It sounded so far-fetched that if I wasn't here, I wouldn't believe it either." Ranger shifted closer, resting his head gently on Emily's leg. Ryan looked down, allowed himself the hint of a smile. "And this guy, Ranger, he's never wrong. Since day one he's been saving lives without asking why. No medals, no applause, he just follows the scent of life. And this time, I think he saved mine too." The wind grew stronger, curling into the basin, shaking the dry limbs above like whispering bones. But Ryan didn't stop. "I know you're tired. I know the pain. I once delivered a baby during an earthquake in Nepal. The mother lost a lot of blood, like you now, but she forced her eyes open. Just once, to see her son before she passed out. Just once. That's all I'm asking from you, Emily. Open your eyes. I swear, I'll get you out of here." And then, barely audible, a moan, rasping from her dry throat. Her lips parted, moving, though no sound came. Her eyelids twitched. Ryan bent lower, heart pounding against his ribs like it might break free. "Yes, that's it. Just like that. You're still here, Emily. Open your eyes. Look at me. You're not alone. You have me. You have Ranger. And you have your baby, still fighting with you." Her lashes flickered, then again. And then, one eye opened. Not fully, not clearly. But there was movement. Recognition. Ryan placed a hand gently on her shoulder, eyes locking onto hers, fogged, dazed, but alive. "That's it. Can you see me?" A faint breath escaped her. Her lips trembled. "My baby." Ryan nodded, his smile soft and full of something unspoken. "He's still here, kicking. You'll see him soon. But I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" Another contraction hit, stronger now, curling her spine. Ryan gripped her hand, counting out breaths with her. He looked to Ranger, the dog now lying flush against her side, tail coiled gently around her ankles like a warm, living blanket. Night had arrived. The mist had thickened. But deep within that remote valley, between cold stone and the breath of the forest, there was still light. Ryan raised the emergency beacon high, securing it to the branch of a tree just above their reach. Its red light flickering faintly through the mist, like a stubborn flame refusing to die, like the final message from humankind to the vast, indifferent sky above. "We're still here. And we're waiting." He turned back, wiped the sweat from Emily's forehead, and gently pressed the water pouch to her lips, letting a few drops fall. She was conscious now. Her eyes, though glassy and dazed, remained open. Her lips still trembled, but her breath was stronger, more present. And in Ryan's hands, those hands now gripped tightly by hers, was life. Real, warm, unwilling to let go. And then, another light appeared in the distance. It wasn't from his beacon. It wasn't from the stars. It was moving. A beam of light descending slowly through the trees from the ridge above. Ranger sprang to his feet. Ryan lifted his head. Someone was coming. At first, the light was no more than a flicker, a faint glow pulsing in the dense fog. But within seconds it expanded. Then another beam appeared beside it, brighter, more focused, and a voice crackled through the radio on Ryan's shoulder, low and fragmented by static. "Mitchell, this is Alpha 6 search team. We picked up a red beacon 10 minutes ago. Do you copy?" Ryan grabbed the radio and pressed down hard on the button. "Alpha 6, this is Mitchell. I'm located at an uncharted position on the southwest slope, bordering Zone 17. Found a live victim. Critical condition, in labor. Request immediate medical evacuation. I repeat, emergency evacuation needed." No reply came right away. Just the sound of wind hissing across the frequency, soft and biting. But then, a voice, clearer now, closer. "Hold position. Helicopter en route to the nearest open clearing. You'll need to move north, roughly 500 meters uphill. Ground team will meet you in 10 minutes. Ryan nodded, even though no one could see. He turned to Ranger. "Get ready. We're taking her up." Ranger let out a short whine and moved closer to Emily, standing guard at her side, as if he already understood the weight of what came next. Ryan knelt, gave one final check to the field kit, reinforced the bandages on Emily's abdomen and hips, then slipped his arms under her, lifting her with slow but firm care, every motion deliberate, swift, and brimming with urgency. Emily winced, a low moan escaping her lips, but she stayed awake. Her eyes, barely open, glimmered with exhaustion, yet deep within them, a fragile spark still clung, the kind that belongs to a mother not yet ready to surrender, even as her body edged closer to its limits. "We're going now, Emily," Ryan whispered, his voice soft but unwavering. "A helicopter's waiting. You and your baby are going to be okay." He strapped her securely against his chest, cinched the harness across his back, and locked the safety clips. Her breath was warm against his neck, faint but present. Ranger took the lead, 4 sturdy legs launching up the muddy, leaf-slicked incline with certainty. Every step up the slope felt like a race against time. Ryan slipped once, knee hitting hard earth, but pushed himself back to his feet instantly. He couldn't stop now. Not when life pulsed against his ribs. From above, the first low rumble of rotor blades rolled across the valley, metal slicing air, echoing off cliffs, a distant thunder announcing salvation. Emily stirred slightly in his arms. Ranger paused, lifted his head, gave a sharp whine, tail twitching. The signal had been received. At the tree line, a response team broke through the mist. 3 figures in bright orange rescue suits, headlamps glowing, arms raised in signal. Ryan ran toward them, breath ragged, eyes burning from sweat and fog, but never loosening his hold on her. "1 casualty, 7 months pregnant, blood loss, just regained consciousness," he called out. "We need to lift her now." 2 medics moved fast, taking Emily gently, placing her onto a transport stretcher already prepped. Ranger circled once, then returned to Ryan's side, sitting with tongue out, eyes locked on the woman now entrusted to others, like he understood how fragile every second had become. Above, the helicopter hovered into position, stirring the tall grass into a frenzy, its spotlight cut through the forest canopy, a blazing shaft of light against the gray that had cloaked them for days. Rotor winds pushed down like a wave, rustling every branch, lifting dirt and swallowing sound. Emily was secured to the lift harness first. Ryan watched from below, hands clenched, breath caught in his chest, as she rose into the air. Then someone turned to him. "You're coming too, dog as well." Ryan didn't answer. He just nodded, knelt to reattach Ranger's harness, then clipped himself to the second lift line. Bozeman Regional Hospital, 0316 a.m. The ER doors burst open. Nurses rushed forward. Emily was wheeled straight into surgery. A doctor jogged beside the gurney, barking orders into a radio. No one asked Ryan's name. No one asked why he was there. They just saw a man covered in dirt, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, shirt torn at the shoulder, and a German shepherd curled under the bench in the waiting area. Soaked through, paws muddy, eyes never leaving the door that had just closed. Ryan sat down. For the first time since the distress signal from Flight 308 disappeared, he let himself exhale. Ranger sat beside him, eyes half closed, breathing slow. 7:47 a.m. Search Command Center, Montana. The door opened. Ryan walked in. The room fell silent. Everyone stood. No one spoke for a moment. The only sound was the steady ping of radar still scanning gray zones for lost signals. A senior officer rose to his feet. "Mitchell?" Ryan nodded. "Emily Blake is alive," he said. "She went into labor. They took her into emergency surgery at dawn." A logistics technician blinked, stunned. "But how did you find that path? That sector wasn't even on the grid." Ryan turned, glanced down at Ranger. "Him. No map is more accurate than his nose." Ranger didn't bark. He just stood beside Ryan, lifted his head, ears tall and sharp. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that the true guide through that night hadn't worn a badge, but carried eyes that listened to the silence between every heartbeat. That evening, when the chaos had quieted and the noise had settled into a lull, Ryan stepped out into the hospital corridor. He didn't ask to speak to a doctor. He didn't request an update. He just needed a moment to breathe. On the 5th-floor balcony, looking down at the fog-covered streets of Bozeman, he leaned against the cold railing, silent. Ranger lay quietly by his feet, head resting on crossed front paws, gaze never drifting far from his handler. And then, a door clicked open behind them. A figure stepped out. A soft voice broke the quiet. "You're the one who brought her in, aren't you?" Ryan turned. Under the pale light, a young doctor stood in the doorway. Blood still dried on his sleeve. His face was tired, worn from hours in the OR. But in his eyes, there was a gleam of something that had survived, something that had borne witness. Something, perhaps, that had been touched by grace. "Is she going to be all right?" Ryan asked, his voice rough and dry, scraped thin by nearly a full day without sleep, without rest, without pause. The doctor gave a small nod, and it felt less like a gesture and more like his entire body, cell by weary cell, was finally exhaling after holding its breath far too long. "She's all right, and the baby too." A beat of silence passed. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because the words that belonged to this moment were too large to be spoken in anything less than reverence. The doctor continued, softer now, as if speaking more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "A boy, preterm, but strong. So strong that the moment he was born, he let out a cry so loud the whole surgical team froze. None of us could believe it." He paused, then looked Ryan straight in the eye, as if trying to ground the impossible. "That they both survived what they did." Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply bowed his head, not in disbelief but in something quieter, deeper, gratitude that reached beyond language. His eyes wanted to close, but his heart had never been more open. And Ranger, lying silently at his feet, lifted his head, as if he too felt something shift in the room, something bigger than instinct, deeper than duty. "She asked about you," the doctor added gently. As soon as she woke up, she said, "Where is the one who brought me out of the forest?" Ryan stood straighter, breathing easier. "I only did my part. Ranger was the one who found her." The doctor smiled, small and sincere. "There are some people born to protect life, and there are some dogs born to remind us that loyalty doesn't need words." 3 days later, room 207. Morning light filtered through the thin white curtains of Bozeman General, casting a soft glow over the quiet hospital room where Emily Blake now rested. Her face pale but peaceful, her hair brushed and tied neatly back, her arms cradling a newborn wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. Still sleeping, still safe. The doctor entered, and behind him, Ryan. He walked slowly, no longer in uniform, just a simple shirt and worn field pants still faintly marked with old mud. Ranger followed closely, his steps so light that the wooden floor didn't even creak. Emily looked up. Her eyes were still puffy from the aftermath of labor, but clearer now, deeper somehow, like someone who had walked through another world and wasn't entirely certain yet that she had truly returned. "We've met before, haven't we?" she said softly, with a faint smile. Ryan nodded. "At last." She turned toward the bassinet beside her. "Would you like to meet my son?" Ryan stepped closer. He leaned in, and he saw the face of a child. The skin still wrinkled, lips a delicate shade of rose, a tiny fist curled as if holding on to something unseen. Thin black hair pressed to the forehead in a perfect swirl. "He looks just like his mother," Ryan said quietly. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes locked on the child, as though still trying to convince herself that this miracle was not a dream, but flesh and breath and real. "I named him James." Ryan froze. She looked at him, voice calm, eyes unwavering as she continued. "James Carter Blake, after the man who gave me the last parachute." The room stilled. Ranger lay beside the bed, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, as if sensing the sacredness of that moment, the silence that needed no words. Ryan bowed his head, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the crib. "James Carter," he repeated, like a vow spoken to the sky. News of Emily's survival, and the rescue that brought her and her child back, spread quickly. From local morning broadcasts in Montana to international coverage, the story of the mother saved by a K-9 swept like wildfire across pine-covered hills. But what silenced the world wasn't the happy ending. It was what came before. The story of a pilot named James Carter, who gave away the final parachute to save a passenger he had never even spoken to. The media called him the hero who never came home. Headlines read, "Pilot dies so another life can be born." BBC replayed the final audio clip recovered from the black box of Flight 308, a 32-second transmission in which James Carter's voice calmly told air traffic control, "If only one survives, let it be her." That sentence became a vow for millions. A small statue was erected outside Bozeman General Hospital. Nothing grand, just a parachute cast in bronze, turned upside down in the wind, beneath it a simple inscription, "For one life, he let go." A week later, in room 207, the late afternoon sun stretched across the corner of the wall. Emily was holding her baby when the door creaked softly open. Ryan stepped in. Ranger followed, this time wearing a small fabric scarf embroidered with the name James. I heard they're holding a ceremony to award Captain Carter posthumously next week? Emily asked, her gaze still fixed on the child. Ryan nodded. At Arlington, his family's flying in from New Jersey. Emily looked down at James. I want to be there. I want my son to hear the name of the man whose blood he doesn't carry, but whose sacrifice lives in his breath. Ryan was silent for a long moment, then said softly, And your son should know. His mother fought, too, as bravely as the man who gave her his chance to live. Emily smiled, turning toward him. Will you be there? Ryan didn't answer immediately, but his eyes dropped to Ranger, and the slow, steady nod of the dog was all the answer that was needed. On the small wooden table by the window, the light of sunset fell across a newly framed photograph. Emily holding James, Ryan standing beside her, Ranger seated at their feet. No one smiled broadly, no one raised a hand. It was just a still moment, quiet, real, complete. And then a knock. A young nurse stepped in, holding a cream envelope, stamped and sealed. It's from the National Aviation Board, she said, for the mother and the rescuer from Flight 308. Ryan took it. On the front, there were only 3 handwritten words. For the boy. No official seal, no formal letterhead. Just a line, scrawled in the quick, unpolished ink of someone who worked in the background. Direct, brief, and sincere. Emily looked at Ryan. He opened the envelope. Inside was a secure memory drive, a neatly printed letter, and one final note written in blue ink. Recovered data from Flight 308's black box, decrypted by request of the lead coordinator. One-time playback authorized at NTSB's confidential review room. We believe you have the right to hear what was left behind. 1 week later, National Transportation Safety Board Headquarters, Washington, D.C., a soundproof room, no windows, a single black screen, a short row of chairs, and a secure audio terminal. Ryan sat in the front row, Emily beside him. Baby James was being cared for by medical staff nearby. Ranger was not in the room, but waited in the hallway, quietly, faithfully, as he always had. A technician entered the room without a word, nodded softly in greeting, and slid a small silver USB drive into the decoder's port. No one spoke. There were no formalities, no fanfare, just the cold click of circuitry coming to life. The first sounds to emerge were a low mechanical hum, then a rising alarm, the sharp clang of metal on metal, and the quickening breaths of someone in the cockpit. Derek's voice, young, taut, unmistakably strained, broke through first. We've lost Engine 2 completely. Emergency landing clearance. Where's the signal? I can't hear them. Then came James Carter. Calm, grounded, not sharp, not panicked. Maintain heading. Prioritize trim. Drop comms. Focus. A pause followed, long enough to feel like it was holding its breath. Then a shriek of metal against wind, the fuselage groaning mid-descent. And over it came the next voice. We've got 3 chutes. We won't have time for all of them. She's pregnant. It was James again, his voice lowered. Almost a whisper, but the recorder caught every syllable with haunting clarity. If only one survives. Let it be her. And then a deep breath. No more words. No impact. Only silence, so profound, so long, that those listening could no longer tell if it was a sound or the vast, aching quiet of the sky before everything lets go. The technician sitting in the back removed his headphones and powered down the screen. Ryan didn't move. Emily, seated beside him, reached over and laid her hand atop his. No tears, no sobs, just a touch, gentle, steady, like a bridge between the living and the one who had chosen not to return. 2 days later, a special report aired simultaneously across national news channels. Over a faded photograph of James Carter, eyes clear, expression composed in his pilot's uniform, the anchorman's voice carried softly. In the final moments before Flight 308 vanished from radar, Captain James Carter left behind a message that has since become a new symbol of sacrifice. If only one survives, let it be her. Schools across New York observed a minute of silence. Airlines circulated messages of remembrance. A grassroots fund was launched under the name The Last Gift, aimed at supporting children born out of disaster or crisis, its purpose inspired by the story of a newborn boy named James Carter Blake. An independent filmmaker sent a request to Bozeman Regional Hospital, asking to make contact. A journalist from The Guardian reached out, requesting an interview with Ryan. Emily turned them all down. She didn't need more headlines. She had her answer. One afternoon, at the makeshift memorial in Bozeman, a sculpture of a parachute tipped sideways in the wind. Ryan stood quietly beside Ranger. The sky had turned golden. Sunlight slanted through a thin layer of cloud, bathing the metal in a soft glow that made it look like it was lifting, carried not by wind, but by memory. Ranger sat silently. No bark, no whine. Ryan looked to the tree line in the distance. In his hand was a copy of the audio recording. The silver USB passed to him with the simple instruction, "Keep it, for the boy." A child should know the name of the one who chose for him to live. Not from textbooks, not from scripts read on television, but through the simplest, most human words ever spoken. Ryan reached down and brushed his hand along Ranger's head. "You heard something too, didn't you, old boy?" Ranger looked up, and in those aged, steady eyes, there was something beyond language, something not meant to be explained, just carried, like the final line from the black box, spoken not to ears, but to hearts. And then, a soft shuffle behind them. Ryan turned. Walking down the gravel path toward the monument was Emily, carrying James in her arms. The little boy held in his hand a miniature pilot's cap, gifted by someone unknown, with no return address, no card, only 3 stitched letters. JCB. No one knew how the gift had arrived at just the right moment. But Ryan did. Some things don't need to be explained, only believed. Emily set James down. He toddled forward, unsteady but fearless, until he reached the base of the sculpture, where Ranger waited. The old dog lifted his head, watching the child with the quiet solemnity of a gatekeeper. No bark, no wag, just a gaze, warm and resolute, like stone amid snow. Ryan watched them, then murmured to no one in particular, "Tomorrow, we go to Arlington." The next day, Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia. The early April sky stretched overhead like a muted gray silk, soft and endless. Fresh green leaves had just begun to bud. A breeze rustled gently through the rows of white markers, straight, orderly, endless, like whispered names on the wind. At the center stood a temporary memorial. White chairs, a red carpet, a folded American flag beside a glass case containing a single medal. And before it all, a large photograph of Captain James Carter. His slight smile, his gaze fixed on something far away. There was no sorrow in the image, only the face of a man who had known every risk and stepped forward anyway. Emily arrived in a simple black dress, hair tied back. James stood at her side, holding her hand. The boy was old enough now to grasp ceremony, but in his eyes still lived the light of innocence, untouched by shadow. Ryan stepped onto the stage, his uniform immaculate. Ranger walked beside him, wearing a special insignia badge reserved for service dogs who had completed their duty. The speaker called out, Captain James Carter, posthumously awarded the Civilian Medal of Heroic Valor. Applause filled the air, quiet at first, then growing, rippling not just among those present, but beyond, through screens broadcasting the ceremony across the nation. Emily approached to receive the medal, hands trembling slightly. But as James followed, his small hand resting gently on hers, everything settled, like the morning bird song that follows a long, silent night. Emily turned to the microphone. No script, no prepared notes, just a voice, clear, grounded, and real. He was a quiet man. He never talked about himself. He left no instructions. He never sought attention. But in the one moment that mattered most, he gave something, not in words, but in choice. My son and I, we are the proof of that. She paused, her gaze drifting to the photograph behind her, eyes not just looking but seeing, through layers of time, sacrifice, and memory. You didn't choose to save a person, she said, her voice steady but touched by something ancient and eternal. You chose to give away a future. And I hope, with everything in me, that one day, James will understand that the name Carter he carries wasn't given to remember, but to live up to. For a moment, the hall fell completely still. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a breath drawn louder than reverence would allow. Only Ranger stood, gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the ceremony, beyond the crowd, beyond even the flag-draped honor. His eyes cast toward something distant, something known only to those who have stood guard over memory itself. After the service had ended, when the crowd had scattered and the folding chairs lay empty in the golden hush of afternoon, Ryan remained behind, seated among the endless white stones of the military cemetery, surrounded by silence that felt deeper than absence. It felt like history, holding its breath. There were no relatives of James Carter present. His parents had passed. He had no wife, no children. From his pocket, Ryan pulled out a folded letter, handwritten in firm, clipped strokes, the kind of writing that doesn't waste space with flourish. It was from Derek Shaw, the co-pilot, the only man to survive the cockpit of Flight 308, penned from a hospital bed not long after the crash. He didn't hesitate. While I was still fumbling with my parachute, James had already turned away. I saw him place a hand on that woman's shoulder. Not shouting, not panicked. He just did what was right. Ryan folded the letter again, slipped it gently back into his pocket. He didn't need more of the story. He didn't need to know what James said or didn't say. He only needed to hold on to the image of a man who had lived fully enough to leave behind light even as he stepped into darkness. On the hill, near where the ceremony had taken place, James, the boy, was running between the rows of empty chairs, his small hand gripping a toy pilot's cap, too big for him, but worn with pride. He stopped at the center, his feet planted in a patch of sunlight, and looked up at the sky, just as the last golden rays broke through the clouds. Emily approached, kneeling beside her son. "Do you want to know what kind of man your namesake was?" she asked. James nodded. She pointed to the sky. "He was the kind of man who helped you see that sky." James tilted his head up, and then he smiled. As the final visitors drifted away from the memorial, Ranger still had not moved. Ryan stepped forward, raising a hand in quiet signal, but Ranger only lifted his head, then turned slowly toward the white marble stone that bore the name James Carter. There was no leash holding him there, no command keeping him in place, only the will of a canine, a dog who had chosen to stand the final watch, not out of duty, but out of something purer, a silent, unshakable devotion. The setting sun spilled its amber light across the western trees, washing the ground in deep, molten gold, illuminating every blade of grass, every etched name, every fold in the earth as if the world itself was bowing in quiet acknowledgement. On the white stone, the engraving was done by hand, simple, unadorned, yet impossible to ignore. To the one who chose someone else's life before his own. Beneath it, there was no biography, no rank, only a single engraving of an open parachute tilting in the wind, drawn not as if it had fallen, but as if it were still catching air, still holding someone aloft. Ryan sat beside Ranger. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because in this moment, silence held more than comfort. It held memory, gratitude, and something deeper than duty. The sacredness of chosen loyalty. Ryan looked at Ranger, whose eyes, once clear and sharp, had grown a little cloudy with age, but still held their quiet fire. And the dog, now old but not weary, wasn't staring at the stone itself, but at something beyond it, something unreachable, invisible, but felt. From a distance, Emily was walking hand in hand with James Carter Blake, the boy now 7 years old, nearly shoulder height to his mother. He wore a navy sweater of his own choosing, pinned with a small silver parachute badge over his heart. In his arms he carried a package wrapped in old newspaper. He said nothing as he approached. He simply came forward, placed the gift at the base of the monument, then looked up at Ranger. The dog tilted his head slightly, then stepped forward with quiet steps, his nose brushing the corner of the wrapping. The paper shifted open, revealing a handmade wooden frame. Inside, drawn in the thick, uneven strokes of a child's hand, was a picture. A plane, a white parachute, a man in uniform, and a dog standing beside him. James bowed his head and spoke quietly. I drew it for him, so anyone who comes will know. Emily placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her voice trembling not from sadness, but from something harder to name. Something stronger. He was there before you were even born, and because of him, you're here now. James said nothing, but after a long moment he looked at the headstone and spoke, not in a whisper. I'll never forget. A wind rose, stirring the pine needles overhead until they rustled like voices in a sacred language. Ryan lifted his head, the light of sunset now fractured across the sky, spilling warmth in its final act. All around them, the world glowed, not brightly, not theatrically, but enough to remind anyone watching that life, somehow, continues. Ranger turned to Ryan, and this time, he stood. No call needed, no command. The moment had passed. And that was enough. Ryan gave a soft nod. He reached for the leash hanging at his side, not to clip it on, but to carry it loosely out of habit. They turned and began to walk away from the memorial. Behind them, the child's drawing still rested at the foot of the stone, its wooden frame casting a long shadow in the golden dust, like a fragment of memory laid gently into the earth, the same earth that had once borne witness to tragedy, now holding the seeds of new life. As the three figures disappeared beyond the line of trees, the wind swept through again, stronger this time. A single purple wildflower was lifted by the breeze, spinning in the air like a whispered prayer before it settled beside the monument. A small sparrow fluttered down, landing on the peak of the headstone, and beneath it, the shadow of the carved parachute stretched across the grass. Not fixed, not still, but looking as if it were, even now, flying. And somewhere far from here, in a modest hallway of the local elementary school, the drawing of James Carter and Ranger had been placed inside a glass frame. Its title, The Last Gift. No one knew how long James had spent drawing it. No one had told him how to sketch a parachute that looked so true to life. They only knew that when someone asked him, "Where do you think he is now?" He smiled and answered, Up high, still flying, but this time, he's looking down.